All right. Well, hey, welcome to session 4 of the Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator, Todd Dorman. I'm the Insight editor at the Gazette and also write a column and editorials. This is the session where we're going to discuss siting decisions, which are related to livestock operations, wind and solar projects, carbon capture pipelines, which you may have heard about. And we're in the energy and environmental track. We'll of course talk to our panelists and address audience questions. And our sessions are closed captioned and they're also being recorded. So I guess first we'd like to thank Lion Energy for sponsoring the energy and environment track, and we have a video. Okay. I don't think I've ever been sponsored before at this conference. I'm excited. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and we have Shannon Raisler, who is the Charlotte and Frederick Hubble Professor of Environmental and Natural Resources Law at the University of Iowa School of Law. Wally Taylor is an executive council member and chairs the Conservation Committee for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. Ben Lipari is Director of Resource Development for Alliant Energy. And John Robbins is Planning and Zoning Administrator for Cerro Gordo County. So welcome to all of you. Appreciate you taking the time to be on the panel today to talk about some important issues. So I guess maybe the longest siting debate in Iowa is over where livestock confinements and feedlots can be built. I've been covering local and state government for about 30 years, and it was a battle when I first started, and continues today. Wally, I'm going to ask you to maybe just give us a summary of where we're at right now. State control has certainly won over local control in Iowa, but is there any sign that that's changing, or what's the landscape on that?
Well, there are a few issues concerning siting livestock facilities. I think we need to probably get out of the way first. One is that there are two aspects of the livestock operation. One is what we call the production area, where the livestock are kept and where the manure is collected and handled. The other aspect is the application fields, where they apply the manure on the crop fields. And the issues are, first of all, with the production area, there are problems with odors that impact neighbors who are near the facility. With respect to the application fields, we need to be clear that we're doing everything we can to make sure that the manure is properly applied so it doesn't cause pollution to nearby waterways. The second thing you have to understand is that there are two kinds of livestock operations in Iowa, at least. The federal law doesn't make any distinction, and there's nowhere else that does, as far as I know. But we have confinement operations and open feedlots. And the confinement operations are subject to different regulations than the open feedlots. The confinement operations, if they're over 1,000 animal units, which is 1,000 cattle or 2,500 hogs, they have to go through a construction permit process which includes what's called the master matrix. And the master matrix, in my view, is a farce. They score certain aspects, and these criteria have been pretty much determined or established by the industry itself. And so they have certain setback distances that have no scientific basis or any basis other than just an arbitrary number. And the matrix is scored, but and counties can, and John maybe talk about this a little more later on, the counties have the right to review that matrix and either recommend approval or not. But the DNR can and usually does ignore the county's recommendation. What often happens with the CAFOs is that they will come in and say they are going to have 2,499 hogs or 999 cattle, so they don't have to do a construction permit and go through the matrix process. The open feedlots have really very few regulations concerning any of this. So we have those aspects. And the other aspect that's maybe not totally a siting issue, but it certainly impacts where the CAFOs are located and the impact that they have, is that the legislature has granted the livestock operations almost complete immunity from nuisance suits. And I don't see any indication this is ever going to change unless we get a different legislature, because most of the problems come from the legislature. The DNR, although they could do a better job perhaps, they're restricted to a great extent by what the legislature has imposed on them. So that's where we are right now.
Well, and the Supreme Court recently took away some protections that had existed to get, for property owners on the nuisance lawsuit front. That's correct, right?
So that was my case. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, the previous Supreme Courts had said over and over again that nuisance immunity was unconstitutional in most cases. Now that Governor Reynolds has appointed 5 of the 7, and the former Governor Branstad appointed the other 2 of the 7 Supreme Court justices, they decided to overrule that prior precedent and say that the nuisance statute is constitutional.
Okay, and the matrix has been around for 20 years. It hasn't been updated. There are counties, even some Republican controlled board of supervisors, that have urged the legislature to take another look at that. I mean, for one thing, you only have to score about 50%, don't you, to pass the matrix, and that and that may not even include, you may not even have to score well on environmental concerns. You can sort of get around that stuff, but that you don't see that happening.
Not at this point, like I say, unless we get a different legislature.
Okay. So another siting issue that's cropped up, in recent years is the siting of wind turbines, wind farms. And I was wondering, Ben, if you can kind of sense, no pun intended, which way the winds are blowing on those local debates, and have they affected Alliant Energy's efforts to expand their use of wind?
Sure. Well, I can cover that pretty generally. As you can imagine, you get to pretty discrete kind of topics and debate at more of a local level, depending on the wind farm and the area where it's looking to site turbines and related infrastructure. We generally take the conversation that happens at a state level and at a community level as constructive. We're interested in siting our facilities where communities are interested in having us. And so there's oftentimes a lot of education that has to happen, especially in communities that haven't had these types of infrastructure and technologies deployed in their communities before. And it's a mixed bag, for those that have had facilities. There's some have really good experiences. You have most that probably initial concerns were alleviated after construction didn't necessarily raise issues that the community thought might they may have expected, or issues that they might have thought would occur through the operations of the wind farms. And so just there becomes more of a general acceptance in the community over time. And then you have some communities where, for whatever reason, and it's always a variety of reasons, it doesn't work as well. And so usually, there's just enough responsibility to go around as it relates to kind of the why behind those issues. But in Iowa in particular, we believe that the technologies, especially on wind, has been deployed long enough where there's an ability to really use a lot of those learnings and best practices to start from a more constructive place as we either look to expand at existing sites or potentially repower sites, and then of course on greenfields as well. So those would be my general thoughts. We believe that a lot of the requests that get made at a local level are reasonable, and sometimes there's a back and forth such that at the end of the day, if the objective is to have a viable project that can advance and be constructed and operate, there oftentimes has to be a little bit of give and take. And certainly we're never starting from a position that we're looking to site turbines or related infrastructure in any way that would certainly create any safety risks or concerns. So then it really becomes around more aesthetic considerations and concerns, and that's often in kind of the eye of the beholder. And I think we've got a really good track record of working with communities and both participating landowners and non-participating landowners. Certainly there's different commercial arrangement in place between those two stakeholder groups, but we welcome and value feedback across all those stakeholders equally, which I think has allowed for us to have a lot of the success we've had as we've now spanned most of Iowa with the different projects that we currently operate. And I think it also, we're involved in these projects oftentimes from the very initial conversations with landowners and local officials, and then with us ultimately being the owner operator of those wind farms. It just sets up for a bit of a different conversation in terms of our intent and our expectation of being part of those communities for the next number of decades, and the responsibility that we assume by doing that. So there are challenges, there'll continue to be challenges, but we also see, like there's usually solutions through just kind of working collaboratively through the community's channels.
And you haven't had to use eminent domain on any of your projects, or is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So John, you're in Cerro Gordo County, near my old stomping grounds. I used to cruise the loop in Mason City on Friday and Saturday nights. We'll go into that later if we have time. So you've had sort of the trifecta of citing, discussions and debates. You've had some solar and wind discussions, and you've also got the Summit carbon pipeline that's planned to go straight through Cerro Gordo County at this point. So what's the the local reaction to these things? What are you seeing in Cerro Gordo County?
Sure. I think kind of first of all, from the local perspective, and Shannon will probably touch on this from her expertise, is on various different types of land uses, whether we even have authority to do certain regulations when it comes to like the confinement side. Our authority's been taken away by the state level, so we have very limited say in citing decisions on that. When it comes to the pipeline type use, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. It's kind of up in the air as far as what we're able to regulate on those citing decisions. PHMSA or the federal level will regulate all safety aspects of that. But citing decisions are at a state level, so the state of Iowa would decide kind of what that would entail. But it does appear that we can exercise some zoning authority to a various extent when it comes to pipelines. And we have a much wider authority when it comes to renewable energy, wind turbines, and that sort of thing. So when it comes to landowners, we get somewhat of a mixed bag, I suppose, wide variety in our area of the state when it comes to renewable energy. We were one of the first counties to ever have a large scale wind farm. It was Hawkeye Power out of Florida, generated the Clear Lake wind farm south of the city of Clear Lake and the lake there back in 1997. Back then, wind was new, so you didn't get a lot of pushback from that sort of thing. Now that renewable energy has become a lot more affordable, that sort of thing, you're getting a little bit more pushback, and it's become more of a not in my backyard type of issue. But there's a lot of pro, there's a lot of against necessarily, and then there's going to be a lot of concerns when it comes to the different types of potential impacts from uses, whether it's noise or shadow flicker with wind, perspective on using ag land for large scale solar. So that's the kind of mixed conversations we get from the local level. And so we have to kind of take that in stride and develop, we're in the process of developing what's called a comprehensive plan, which is sort of a high level discussion of your vision on different types of land uses. So wind and solar are going to be a big conversation as we go through this process over the next year in our county. And then we'll implement that with our zoning ordinance and different policies and develop those different requirements over time, probably in about a year for our county. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag, and that's and the most I get is questions, I guess. People are a little bit more down the middle. There's definitely people on both sides of the issue with a lot of concerns with climate change nowadays, but also our landowners have to live by the use, and so they may have visual concerns, noise concerns, all those sorts of things. So yeah.
So it seemed like when wind farms started to be developed in Iowa, there were a lot of landowners that seemed anxious to get the money that comes with allowing turbines on their land. What do you think changed? I mean, is it just more skepticism of corporations, government that we see, institutions, or what do you make of that?
There's probably a couple things when it comes to that sort of thing. One is the how widespread it's starting to become. There's a lot of concern that all you'll see are wind turbines all throughout the county. Is that something that we want to see? How dense do we want that to be? Where is it appropriate? That kind of thing. So now people are more aware. So that's going to be kind of where some of the pushback is coming from, I feel. And then some of it is just perceptions have changed, whether it's, I do hear a lot of misinformation when it comes to the wind side, especially. And so making sure information is delineated so people understand what the truth actually is when it comes to like how noisy these things are, or issues such as, like, you may have heard, like low frequency sound concerns, or infrasound is another thing that's come up in our area that people are concerned about, especially in neighboring counties. So the perception has changed in that regard. So those are kind of the two big ones I would say
Mhm.
I've seen.
What you mentioned the noise and the shadow flicker. Are there other sort of misconceptions that you're running into that people have about the turbines?
The infrasound is kind of like how harmful that is to human health, and that's a valid concern. I mean, I think, I'm not an acoustician, whatever the term is there, but but that's something that's very hard to regulate. There are people that are sensitive to low vibrations and that sort of thing. I do get like comments from landowners that, some, like a machine shed that's not built up to like the specs of a home, you may get vibration of metal from, if it's fairly close to a large wind turbine. So I can understand that perception a little bit and those concerns. Shadow flicker, there's not a lot of, it's hard to test the science of human health when it comes to wind turbines, and that's just a fact. And so trying to balance those potential impacts for a wind turbine, we try to take a balanced approach in our county as we currently kind of handle things. But it's hard to say, I guess.
And yeah, and with solar, the main objection is taking up, prime farmland. That was something we heard in Lynn County with the 2 solar projects that have been approved here. Is that sort of the primary concern, and also not wanting to live next to a solar array, or what are you hearing?
Those would be the 2 primary ones. Yeah, definitely eating up a lot of farmland for potentially square miles worth of a utility scale solar is a concern that I hear. And then the other one is the visual aspect. It's a lot of people consider them more of an industrial type use as opposed to a farm type use. But there's arguments on both sides for that.
Sure. So Shannon, the law on livestock siding has been pretty well established over the last 30 years, and what powers local governments have or don't have. But these other discussions about solar and wind, they seem to have more authority with that. But the pipeline issue, you've got some counties trying to do some ordinances. You've got people calling for local governments to do more to stop the pipelines. What authority do they have, and can they make an impact on any of these projects?
So it might be useful to start with just a kind of primer on local government authority. It's just the law teacher in me that wants to go there, right? And make sure everyone understands that it's the way it is here isn't a given, right? This is, local governments are creatures of state law. So what the state gives, it can take away. And I think this discussion has already illustrated that, right? So it could give local governments more authority in the siting of animal feeding operations. Minnesota gives counties more authority, for example. It could give counties less authority to cite wind and solar, right? So that's going one way or the other. The state legislature could do that. Ohio has preempted recently local authority in this area. And so I just want to illustrate how this is subject, right, to the political winds, so to speak. And if it can be pretty unpopular, right, to preempt local authority, but it kind of depends on the political constituency, right? Agriculture and the hog industry is really quite powerful here, and so they really want state level regulations, right? They don't want to go county by county. We'll see what happens with wind and solar. Some people think we might see action at the state legislature at some point. A lot of counties are taking their time. We saw Lynn County announce recently a moratorium. Johnson County did something similar at one point, just to review what they have on the books. John mentioned this notion of a comprehensive plan. And under state law, if you want zoning authority and you want to exercise that authority in a meaningful way, you really do need a comprehensive plan, because everything you do is supposed to be consistent with it. So right now across Iowa, we see some counties who have done a lot of planning. Again, Lynn and Johnson counties are good examples, where they have a plan and they can enact ordinances that follow that plan. And then we have smaller counties, right, that haven't had to really face these issues, that are scrambling to figure out, well, what do we do, right? We need an ordinance on the books that will make us less susceptible to legal challenge, right? There's a lawsuit pending over one of the siting approvals in Lynn County. One of the legal complaints in that case is it's not consistent with your comprehensive plan. Now we'll see if there's any traction there. I don't know, but that is one of the challenges people can bring. So I think counties are rightly engaged in those planning efforts under state law to make sure that they are less susceptible to legal challenge. And then I think you threw in the carbon pipelines. It remains to be seen, I think, right? I mean, that I'd be interested in hearing from others to what extent did Dakota Access raise this issue, for example, because the IUB will eventually be able to hear requests for eminent domain, right? In the siting of these pipelines, that happens at the state level. Maybe there are some zoning setbacks, right? You can't locate next to a school or a hospital, for example, that local governments might be able to enforce, but they're not going to have the authority, at least as it looks right now, to say you can't locate here at all, right, in this county. But perhaps others can chime in on that.
Well, Wally, you're the Sierra Club is in opposition to these carbon pipelines for various reasons. Maybe you could explain that, and then what you think maybe local governments can or can't do to affect these projects.
Okay. The federal agency that John was talking about is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, affectionately called PHMSA. And their jurisdiction is over safety of the pipeline itself. So they have nothing to do with siting. Even if the siting sort of impacts safety, the county still has the authority to pass an ordinance that can restrict where that pipeline is sited in the county. And the Iowa Code, Chapter 479B, tells the IUB that they need to consider the county land use. And as a practical matter, the IUB has customarily issued their permits for the pipelines subject to compliance with local county zoning or land use ordinances. So I think the counties have a lot more authority than maybe they've been led to believe.
And these projects have some pretty potent political support, right? You've got with the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline, you've got former Governor Terry Branstad, you've got former Reynolds administration official, former Governor Tom Vilsack's son. I mean, there's just sort of a who's who of former politicians and donors, and both parties, seem to pay fealty to ethanol, which is what these pipelines are supposed to help, is the ethanol industry sell its product in California and places where there's going to be stricter emission standards and more, demand for greener fuel. Do you think that political, that political weight with the IUB is maybe going to overcome whatever sort of authority the counties might have?
Well, you never know, but certainly that's a consideration. Governor Branstad appointed 2 of the IUB members, and Governor Reynolds reappointed the chair, and Governor Reynolds appointed the 3rd member. And the 3rd member's daughter works for Governor Reynolds. So it's one big happy family.
Could I jump in and say,
Sure.
this, I think it's important to note that this is driven by federal subsidies. So
Right.
I think a lot of people listening to us are worried about climate change, right? And this is a Biden administration policy before the IRA, before the Inflation Reduction Act, very much to create a network of carbon pipelines in the Midwest, with Iowa right in the middle. That you can go to their website, at least about last spring, I could find on their website the map that showed kind of their vision for an expanded carbon pipeline network, which really thus far in our history has been limited to kind of in the South and oil producing regions to enhanced oil recovery. So the carbon is used for enhanced oil recovery. But the idea here is that we would actually we would sequester and store the carbon from industries like ethanol and fertilizer plants. So I think if the political clout and the people with money are going to come, right, if the federal subsidies are available.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's a complicated issue in that, folks who care about the environment, they all agree on, the livestock confinements should have local control of siting, and that these are a problem. But then, yeah, a big chunk of the Inflation Reduction Act's climate change package is to boost these tax cuts by hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's one of their main tools for fighting climate change. But in Iowa, I mean, there's a dispute between folks who care about the environment as to whether these pipelines are truly a climate change step, or whether they're just sort of lining the pockets of the ethanol industry and the investors in these pipelines. I know the Sierra Club here has taken the position, Wally, that that you're doubtful of the climate change benefit of the pipelines.
Yes. What the proposal is to capture the carbon dioxide from the fermentation process in the ethanol production, but not the CO2 from the power plant that powers the ethanol plant, which is a much bigger source of CO2 than the fermentation process. And furthermore, this just lengthens the time we're going to be dependent on oil and gasoline. We need to go to electric vehicles and other ways to reduce our dependence on oil, and this doesn't do that. And as far as selling this ethanol that's supposed to be cleaner to California and other states that have clean fuel standards, those states are phasing out gasoline-powered vehicles in the next several years. So this is a very short-term profit-making scheme for Bruce Rastetter and others, and it does nothing, or very, very little at least, to address the climate problem. So, and as Shannon says, what's really driving this is the 45Q tax credit, which has nothing to do with how effective this process is in in reducing greenhouse gases or addressing climate change?
There's a question from the audience. It's for Shannon, and they're asking whether you could please explain your reasoning for thinking a county could not institute a moratorium on CO2 pipelines, just like some have done with solar and wind.
So I didn't mean to suggest
Okay.
that you can't do that. So thanks for the opportunity to clarify. The counties, my understanding of the counties have done, like Lynn County, is it's the moratorium on applications for new utility scale solar while they look at their ordinances and make sure that they're doing it the way they feel is most consistent with their comprehensive plan, right? So they want, and also for energy companies, right, to signal to them what it takes to get their projects approved, right? What is a county going to require, for example, with respect to setbacks, right? And with respect to vegetation requirements and fencing and all of those important issues to those neighboring landowners, right? That's the reason people are showing up and expressing their concerns. So counties want to address that ahead of time rather than as part of a case-by-case process with each new applicant, right? So there's no reason a county couldn't engage in that process now and review its authority, as Wally suggested, to have some role in the siting of pipelines, right? I think that's fuzzier just because the IUB does have the ability to give Summit and the carbon pipeline companies the power to use eminent domain. I do think there's a lot of pressure to move all of this forward. So a complete ban by a county on the pipeline would be an interesting legal case, right? I mean, Wally might be able, I'm not aware of something. Dakota Access is the only thing that comes to mind, and I'm not aware that happened in that situation. So I don't know if we know what the outcome would be.
In Dakota Access, the counties really did not engage like they're engaging with the CO2 pipelines. I think we all learned a great deal from the Dakota Access case. You know, that was the first really big pipeline, a project Iowa had seen. And so we were all taken off guard a little bit, I think. And that's one of the reasons why when Summit was the first one to announce a pipeline project, I realized that we needed to get the landowners organized. And so the Sierra Club took the lead. I see Jess Mazur is one of the audience here. She's been just fantastic in organizing the landowners. The landowners in Dakota Access had engaged a little bit, but they weren't organized. They had several different groups. They had some landowners who were just on their own, and it was not the unified efforts that we have now. And I think that's made a big difference. And the landowners who were impacted by Dakota Access, even now, 6 years after the pipe was installed, still see a reduced yield of their crops on the right-of-way where the pipeline was constructed.
One of the folks in the audience makes an observation and asks a question. They say there are large feeding operations, row crop agriculture practices negatively, and row crop agriculture processes negatively impact Iowa's water quality. Ethanol's issue is food versus fuel, including the number of gallons of water needed to produce a gallon of ethanol. Wind and solar are sustainable energy sources. Do you see any solution to these opposing forces that, you know, we've seen rural landowners against renewable energy projects? Not sure who wants to field that. I don't know, John, if you have thoughts on that, whether those opposing interests can find a solution.
Yeah, I guess it's that's a tough one as far as coming finding solutions between competing land uses. I mean, that's kind of something that zoning is always trying to find solutions to. And I'll always kind of come back to a county comprehensive plan. And then the other side of things is, what will the state allow a local jurisdiction to do? Until you have the state level allowing local counties to have some sort of say in the siting of confinements operations and feeding operations, there's not a lot you can do at the local level. It really becomes a political question at that point with well, pretty much any siting topic. And really, if we had authority, we would, hash that out in our high level vision of our comprehensive plan, as Shannon kind of explained. I think a good example is your solar siting. You have competing interests with the agricultural croplands being taken up by utility scale solar. You have your, on one side of things, it's your food supply. On the other side of things, it's getting clean energy and trying to mitigate climate change the best you can. I kind of see Johnson County sort of as a model ordinance. Shannon kind of alluded to the moratorium they did to allow for them to update their ordinance to kind of address some of these potential impacts. And for example, in the application requirements that they've established in their zoning ordinance, they require a submission of an agricultural impact plan. So addressing that sort of thing. How's it? Maybe there's a concept called agrivoltaics where you could do some sort of farming underneath. So different varieties of farming or pasture land where you actually have, like, say, sheep grazing or cattle grazing around solar panels. So that's sort of a balance in that sort of situation. But again, until you have some sort of authority where you can establish some sort of solutions, it becomes a political question what you're able to do locally.
Yeah. Well, maybe they can agree that both sides are, are using the sun to create energy. I mean, that's,
Right.
Well, growing
some
corn
people refer it to as farming the sun, right?
yeah, right. Which the farmers do every growing season. So, and that's, that's been part of the rub also on the pipelines for the ethanol plants, is that, is ethanol the intensive row crop production that's needed to excuse me, to meet the demand. I think, what is it, 50 or 60% of our corn crop is made into biofuel. To meet that demand, you've got to do a more intensive row crop agriculture, which means the potential for nitrate and phosphorus runoff and all of these bad economic outcomes. And yet, ethanol is still a strong force in Iowa. Is that, I mean, when the Sierra Club thinks about it, I suppose that's one of the things you're adding into your calculations is the water quality aspect of row crop agriculture.
Oh, sure. And we have done a report on what sustainable agriculture would look like, impacting soil health and growing crops that people can eat. And certainly agriculture is the main source of our water impairments in Iowa. And so we really need to take a good hard look at how we do agriculture. And I think, the farmers really are not necessarily to blame. They're kind of put in a bind by the big ag companies and the monopolies that control meat and the processing of grain and all of that. So we just really need to look at our agricultural system and see if there are ways that we can do it better.
Well, I think more than half the land farmed in Iowa is owned by absentee landowners.
Yeah,
So
that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what happens.
Yeah, but it might be more difficult to convince those absentee, landowners to put measures in place to improve water quality because, they like a rent check and don't necessarily want to spend a bunch of money on water quality measures.
That may be, although I think most of the absentee landowners in Iowa, at least from what, this is not a scientific survey, it's just my observation, that many of the absentee landowners are the folks whose family has owned that land for years, farmed it, but the current generation is not farming it, they're renting it to tenants. But I think most of those landowners still care about that land.
Yeah, that's the case with my family. I've had some land, came down through generations, but this generation and none of us farm. So yeah, but we do care about it. So Ben, sorry I haven't gotten back to you for a while. Does Land Energy okay with operating with the current system where you're dealing with sort of the dreaded patchwork, as people say, of rules and regulations and local ordinances, or would you like to see the state step in and create some sort of uniform rules for wind and solar?
I tend to be more in favor of setting some state guidelines, but allowing for communities to have involvement, certainly as these projects advance. So it's a blend. I think gets us to a good place where like to my comments earlier, we're nurturing and being responsive to feedback that we're hearing locally, while at the same time, as an industry, we're adhering to expectations and best practices that can be managed maybe a little bit more effectively at a state level.
Mm-hmm. What's Land Energy's current, I guess, renewable portfolio? What percentage are you generating from renewables?
Sure, around 40%. Yeah, depending on how you look at the data. If your question was overarching Alliant Energy, Wisconsin and Iowa, I think we're upwards of 40%, especially by the end of next year, as we're seeing a gigawatt of solar that'll have come online between construction of projects this year and expected construction of projects next year. We have active projects that we're advancing in Iowa that are part of an ongoing rate making principal docket with the IUB that we're expecting decisions soon that would potentially allow for 400 megawatts of solar to advance by the end of 24, as well as some battery storage technology installations. So we're very much, launching into, some decent scale across these new resource types that hadn't gotten their traction for various reasons here in the upper Midwest, but now very much have a role in terms of satisfying a lot of the decarbonization goals that we have at a local level, at a state level. I mean, there's very much a convergence at a corporate level. We're seeing just a large volume of corporate interest, and not just from customers that currently have operations in Iowa, but also for customers that are looking to site new facilities. So very exciting time. And I think to the extent, some of your questions and topics, Todd, have been around how can we integrate across, these different technologies and infrastructure and, generation and sources of fuel. It's going to require a balance. So the renewables initiate and enable the sustainability and decarbonization targets, while at the same time, needing to have some of those technologies, especially in the interim, when you don't have, long-term storage, for instance, available at an economic cost. We've got businesses that need to be able to rely on 24/7 power. So renewables and some of the current storage will have a role with that. And then, you're going to have some of these more legacy technologies that maybe get improved and have less emission profiles, but still have a place in portfolios, at least for the near term.
Right. So regarding the pipelines, I guess the main issue at the State House was whether or not to stop projects from using eminent domain, or at least put a moratorium on using eminent domain that would, well, I guess mostly would get lawmakers past the election, but I mean, maybe perhaps longer term. Did any of you get a sense that there's any legislative will to do that, or do you think once the election's over, it's that those projects will move ahead without much political encumberment from the State House?
Well, during the last session, we had a couple of bills. One that was introduced in the Senate by a Republican from Sioux County, if you can imagine that. And it would have done away with eminent domain for any project approved by the Iowa Utilities Board. And we got it passed a subcommittee of 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. Then, as I understand it, the lobbyists for Summit burned the phone lines that night and were calling everybody they could think of and putting pressure on. And so when it got to the full committee the next day or a couple of days later, it didn't see the light of day. So it's obvious that, and there were a lot of Republican legislators who supported that bill, but the word came down from wherever you can speculate that to Senate leadership that this bill wasn't supposed to go anywhere, and it didn't. In the Iowa House, there were some bills, one just like the Senate bill, another one that said eminent domain could not be used unless the pipeline company had like 90% of the parcels signed up with voluntary easements. And none of those went anywhere. So, but there is some Republican support and almost all Democratic support for some restriction on eminent domain, but the Republican leadership isn't there yet.
Mm-hmm. So, with regard to livestock sighting, it might be best to rewrite the matrix, or to give local governments more control over siting. There's the pipeline moratorium issue and the environmental issues that go along with pipelines. And with solar and wind, we might need some state guidelines, or maybe not. What do you think we've got these issues and we're getting short on time. I mean, what would each of you like to, I guess, see moving forward to help you do your jobs and to protect the environment and to protect landowner rights? Anybody can jump in. Shannon, you want to?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I really want to follow on what Wally was saying about eminent domain. Again, the sort of broader context. What's so interesting about the use of eminent domain in this context is, and many people wonder about this, right? It's the giving of this authority to a private entity, right? Summit is not a state actor. That comes from the Supreme Court decision, the Kelo case in 2005, where the court said, yes, a municipality could give that eminent domain authority consistent with its comprehensive plan to an entity to engage in economic development, right? So economic development defined largely in terms of jobs and revenue, right? There was a big backlash to the Supreme Court opinion by the states. A lot of states, including Iowa, said, we don't like that. I mean, that is a big overreach on the part of government, right? So you do have a lot of Republicans and Democrats alike saying that it's a violation of our private property rights. We shouldn't be able to use eminent domain in this fashion where we give it to private entities and they get to exercise it for economic development. And we are kind of an economic development plus state. So one of the issues moving forward with the use of eminent domain for these pipelines is what's the plus, right? So the pipelines may provide some jobs, some revenue, but our Supreme Court has said that's not enough, right? There needs to be some other public benefit for Iowans, right? So they're likely to argue climate change mitigation, right? But there will be an interesting, I think, legal question as to whether that kind of diffuse benefit is enough. We have some precedent in this area. So I just thought I might offer that background because I think this is part of a much longer debate about private property and the role of eminent domain in economic development, right, on the part of exercised by the government.
Yeah, the Iowa legislature, after that Supreme Court decision, swung into action and passed to law to limit the use of eminent domain, and Governor Vilsack vetoed it, and the legislature came back and overrode his veto. So that's how strongly both parties felt about that at the time. So
And
as
that's the law. That's the law that exempted private projects that are permitted by the IUB, and that's what we were trying to address.
So it'd be, in a perfect world, the legislature would come in and clarify what, better clarify what public benefit is. But I mean, that's a tough legislative lift. So yeah, well, I guess I'll give anybody a chance now. We're down to the final few minutes. I got the 5-minute warning, and I'm not sure how long ago I did. So because I was too busy listening. So if anyone has parting thoughts, stuff that you want to add that I didn't ask about or that you think is important.
As a county person, I just want to note that a lot of these intensive land uses have local impact. So where our interest comes into play is how is a wind turbine, how is a solar farm, how is a pipeline, how's a CAFO confinement going to impact the neighbors immediately around it, and how does that impact the jurisdiction? I think I can speak for a lot of zoning administrators at the county level or city level for that matter, where we think that it's necessary to have some local authority. There's definitely areas where some state guidelines wouldn't be a bad thing. What maybe for a wind turbine that's a certain distance from a residence, that can be consistent with scientific research or what have you, and that actual impact. But having some sort of authority at a local level, there's always going to be some sort of specific circumstances with a wind farm, because there's going to be a variety of circumstances where the geography, floodplains, you name it, that will have impact on these landowners, or just public drainage districts, whole slew of sort of issues, private property rights, those sorts of things. I don't think counties are necessarily against some state guidelines depending on the use, but we'd hope to be consulted so we can offer our expertise on any state legislation. But yeah, ultimately, hopefully we can have some sort of say when it comes to specific siting decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very appropriate.
Yeah, good thoughts. I mean, local control has sort of taken a beating in recent years. So yeah, it'd be nice to see some authority go back to where government closer to the people. So I guess we're under a minute. So I'll just thank all of you for taking part. I think it was a good discussion. I think we solved all the problems. And so that's good. No, I've never been on a panel where we solved all the problems. So, I mean, well, we're still going to keep working on it, I guess, but I appreciate it. And then the next panel I think that's coming up is on this track is a water I think it's the big idea panel where they're going to talk about the Mississippi River watershed and Iowa's role in the, you know, condition of that watershed and with nitrate and phosphorus pollution and all of that. So that's another big topic that won't be likely be solved during the panel. But I appreciate again all of you joining us, and encourage everyone to, you know, check out some other panels if you get a chance. So
Thank you.